Mr. Prohartchin, a short story by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In the darkest and humblest corner of Ustinya, Fyodorovna's flat, lived Semyon Ivanovich Prohartchin, a well-meaning elderly man who did not drink. Since Mr. Prohartchin was of a very humble grade in the service and received a salary strictly proportionate to his official capacity, Ustinya Fyodorovna could not get more than 5 rubles a month from him for his lodging. Some people said that she had her own reasons for accepting him as a lodger, but be that as it may, as though in despite of all his detractors, Mr. Prohartchin actually became her favorite, in an honorable and virtuous sense, of course. It must be observed that Ustinya Fyodorovna, a very respectable woman who had a special partiality for meat and coffee and found it difficult to keep the fasts, let rooms to several other boarders who paid twice as much as Semyon Ivanovich, yet not being quiet lodgers, but on the contrary, all of them spiteful scoffers at her feminine ways and her forlorn helplessness, stood very low in her good opinion, so that if it had not been for the rent they paid, she would not have cared to let them stay, nor indeed to see them in her flat at all. Semyon Ivanovich had become her favorite from the day when a retired, or perhaps more correctly speaking, discharged clerk with a weakness for strong drink was carried to his last resting place in Volkovo. Though this gentleman had only one eye, having had the other knocked out owing, in his own words, to his valiant behaviour, and only one leg, the other having been broken in the same way owing to his valour. Yet he had succeeded in winning all the kindly feeling of which Ustinya Fyodorovna was capable, and took the fullest advantage of it, and would probably have gone on for years living as her devoted satellite and toady if he had not finally drunk himself to death in the most pitiable way. All this had happened at Pesky, where Ustinya Fyodorovna only had 3 lodgers, of whom, when she moved into a new flat and set up on a larger scale, letting to about a dozen new boarders, Mr. Prohartchin was the only one who remained. Whether Mr. Prohartchin had certain incorrigible defects, or whether his companions were, every one of them, to blame, there seemed to be misunderstandings on both sides from the first. We must observe here that all Ustinya Fyodorovna's new lodgers, without exception, got on together like brothers. Some of them were in the same office. Each one of them by turns lost all his money to the others at faro, preference and bix. They all liked, in a merry hour, to enjoy what they called the fizzing moments of life in a crowd together. They were fond, too, at times of discussing lofty subjects, and though in the end things rarely passed off without a dispute, yet as all prejudices were banished from the whole party, the general harmony was not in the least disturbed thereby. The most remarkable among the lodgers were Mark Ivanovich, an intelligent and well-read man, then Oplevaniev, then Prepolovenko, also a nice and modest person. Then there was a certain Zinovy Prokofyevich, whose object in life was to get into aristocratic society. Then there was Okeanov, the copying clerk, who had in his time almost wrested the distinction of prime favourite from Semyon Ivanovich. Then another copying clerk called Sudbin, the plebeian Kantarev. There were others too. But to all these people Semyon Ivanovich was, as it were, not one of themselves. No one wished him harm, of course, for all had from the very first done Prohartchin justice, and had decided in Mark Ivanovich's words that he, Prohartchin, was a good and harmless fellow, though by no means a man of the world, trustworthy, and not a flatterer, who had, of course, his failings, but that if he were sometimes unhappy, it was due to nothing else but lack of imagination. What is more, Mr. Prohartchin, though deprived in this way of imagination, could never have made a particularly favourable impression from his figure or manners, upon which scoffers are fond of fastening, yet his figure did not put people against him. Mark Ivanovich, who was an intelligent person, formally undertook Semyon Ivanovich's defence, and declared in rather happy and flowery language that Prohartchin was an elderly and respectable man, who had long, long ago passed the age of romance. And so, if Semyon Ivanovich did not know how to get on with people, it must have been entirely his own fault. The first thing they noticed was the unmistakable parsimony and niggardliness of Semyon Ivanovitch. That was at once observed and noted, for Semyon Ivanovitch would never lend anyone his teapot, even for a moment. And that was the more unjust as he himself hardly ever drank tea, but when he wanted anything drank, as a rule, rather a pleasant decoction of wild flowers and certain medicinal herbs, of which he always had a considerable store. His meals, too, were quite different from the other lodgers. He never, for instance, permitted himself to partake of the whole dinner, provided daily by Ustinya Fyodorovna for the other boarders. The dinner cost half a rouble. Semyon Ivanovitch paid only 25 kopecks in copper and never exceeded it, and so took either a plate of soup with pie or a plate of beef. Most frequently he ate neither soup nor beef, but he partook in moderation of white bread with onion, curd, salted cucumber, or something similar, which was a great deal cheaper, and he would only go back to his half-rouble dinner when he could stand it no longer. Here the biographer confesses that nothing would have induced him to allude to such realistic and low details, positively shocking and offensive to some lovers of the heroic style, if it were not that these details exhibit one peculiarity, one characteristic, in the hero of this story. For Mr. Prohartchin was by no means so poor as to be unable to have regular and sufficient meals, though he sometimes made out that he was. But he acted as he did regardless of obloquy and people's prejudices, simply to satisfy his strange whims, and from frugality and excessive carefulness. All this, however, will be much clearer later on. But we will beware of boring the reader with the description of all Semyon Ivanovitch's whims, and will omit, for instance, the curious and very amusing description of his attire. And in fact, if it were not for Ustinya Fyodorovna's own reference to it, we should hardly have alluded even to the fact that Semyon Ivanovitch never could make up his mind to send his linen to the wash, or if he ever did so, it was so rarely that in the intervals one might have completely forgotten the existence of linen on Semyon Ivanovitch. From the landlady's evidence, it appeared that Semyon Ivanovitch, bless his soul, poor lamb, for 20 years had been tucked away in his corner, without caring what folks thought, for all the days of his life on earth he was a stranger to socks, handkerchiefs, and all such things. And what is more, Ustinya Fyodorovna had seen with her own eyes, thanks to the decrepitude of the screen, that the poor dear man sometimes had had nothing to cover his bare skin. Such were the rumours in circulation after Semyon Ivanovitch's death. But in his lifetime, and this was one of the most frequent occasions of dissension, he could not endure it if anyone, even somebody on friendly terms with him, poked his inquisitive nose uninvited into his corner, even through an aperture in the decrepit screen. He was a taciturn man, difficult to deal with and prone to ill health. He did not like people to give him advice. He did not care for people who put themselves forward either, and if anyone jeered at him or gave him advice unasked, he would fall foul of him at once, put him to shame, and settle his business. You are a puppy. You are a featherhead. You are not one to give advice. So there, you mind your own business, sir. You'd better count the stitches in your own socks, sir. So there. Semyon Ivanovitch was a plain man, and never used the formal mode of address to anyone. He could not bear it either when someone who knew his little ways would begin from pure sport, pestering him with questions, such as what he had in his little trunk. Semyon Ivanovitch had one little trunk. It stood under his bed and was guarded like the apple of his eye, and though everyone knew that there was nothing in it except old rags, 2 or 3 pairs of damaged boots and all sorts of rubbish, yet Mr. Prohartchin prized his property very highly, and they used even to hear him at one time express dissatisfaction with his old but still sound lock, and talk of getting a new one of a special German pattern with a secret spring and various complications. When on one occasion Zinovy Prokofyevitch, carried away by the thoughtlessness of youth, gave expression to the very coarse and unseemly idea that Semyon Ivanovitch was probably hiding and treasuring something in his box to leave to his descendants, everyone who happened to be by was stupefied at the extraordinary effects of Zinovy Prokofyevitch's sally. At first, Mr. Prohartchin could not find suitable terms for such a crude and coarse idea. For a long time, words dropped from his lips quite incoherently, and it was only after a while they made out that Semyon Ivanovitch was reproaching Zinovy Prokofyevitch for some shabby action in the remote past. Then they realized that Semyon Ivanovitch was predicting that Zinovy Prokofyevitch would never get into aristocratic society, and that the tailor to whom he owed a bill for his suits would beat him, would certainly beat him, because the puppy had not paid him for so long. And finally, "You puppy, you," Semyon Ivanovitch added. "Here you want to get into the hussars, but you won't, I tell you, you'll make a fool of yourself. And I tell you what, you puppy, when your superiors know all about it, they will take and make you a copying clerk. So that will be the end of it. Do you hear, puppy?" Then Semyon Ivanovitch subsided, but after lying down for 5 hours, to the intense astonishment of everyone he seemed to have reached a decision, and began suddenly reproaching and abusing the young man again, at first to himself, and afterwards addressing Zinovy Prokofyevitch. But the matter did not end there, and in the evening, when Mark Ivanovitch and Prepolovenko made tea and asked Okeanov to drink it with them, Semyon Ivanovitch got up from his bed, purposely joined them, subscribing his 15 or 20 kopecks, and on the pretext of a sudden desire for a cup of tea, began at great length going into the subject, and explaining that he was a poor man, nothing but a poor man, and that a poor man like him had nothing to save. Mr. Prohartchin confessed that he was a poor man on this occasion, he said, simply because the subject had come up, that the day before yesterday he had meant to borrow a rouble from that impudent fellow, but now he should not borrow it for fear the puppy should brag, that that was the fact of the matter, and that his salary was such that one could not buy enough to eat, and that finally, a poor man, as you see, he sent his sister-in-law in Tver 5 roubles every month, that if he did not send his sister-in-law in Tver 5 roubles every month, his sister-in-law would die, and if his sister-in-law, who was dependent on him, were dead, he, Semyon Ivanovitch, would long ago have bought himself a new suit. And Semyon Ivanovitch went on talking in this way at great length about being a poor man, about his sister-in-law, and about roubles, and kept repeating the same thing over and over again to impress it on his audience till he got into a regular muddle and relapsed into silence. Only 3 days later, when they had all forgotten about him and no one was thinking of attacking him, he added something in conclusion to the effect that when Zinovy Prokofyevitch went into the hussars, the impudent fellow would have his leg cut off in the war, and then he would come with a wooden leg and say, "Semyon Ivanovitch, kind friend, give me something to eat." And then Semyon Ivanovitch would not give him something to eat, and would not look at the insolent fellow, and that's how it would be, and he could just make the best of it. All this naturally seemed very curious, and at the same time fearfully amusing. Without much reflection, all the lodgers joined together for further investigation, and simply from curiosity determined to make a final onslaught on Semyon Ivanovitch en masse. And as Mr. Prohartchin, too, had of late, that is, ever since he had begun living in the same flat with them, been very fond of finding out everything about them and asking inquisitive questions, probably for private reasons of his own, relations sprang up between the opposed parties without any preparation or effort on either side, as it were by chance and of itself. To get into relations, Semyon Ivanovitch always had in reserve his peculiar, rather sly and very ingenious maneuver, of which the reader has learned something already. He would get off his bed about tea-time, and if he saw the others gathered together in a group to make tea, he would go up to them like a quiet, sensible and friendly person, hand over his 20 kopecks, as he was entitled to do, and announce that he wished to join them. Then the young men would wink at one another, and so indicating that they were in league together against Semyon Ivanovitch, would begin a conversation, at first strictly proper and decorous. Then one of the wittier of the party would, apropos of nothing, fall to telling them news consisting most usually of entirely false and quite incredible details. He would say, for instance, that someone had heard His Excellency that day telling Demid Vassilievitch that in his opinion Married clerks were more trustworthy than unmarried, and more suitable for promotion, for they were steady, and that their capacities were considerably improved by marriage, and that therefore he, that is, the speaker, in order to improve and be better fitted for promotion, was doing his utmost to enter the bonds of matrimony as soon as possible with a certain Fevronia Prokofyevna. Or he would say that it had more than once been remarked about certain of his colleagues that they were entirely devoid of social graces and of well-bred, agreeable manners, and consequently unable to please ladies in good society, and that therefore to eradicate this defect, it would be suitable to deduct something from their salary, and with the sum so obtained, to hire a hall where they could learn to dance, acquire the outward signs of gentlemanliness and good breeding, courtesy, respect for their seniors, strength of will, a good and grateful heart, and various agreeable qualities. Or he would say that it was being arranged that some of the clerks, beginning with the most elderly, were to be put through an examination in all sorts of subjects to raise their standard of culture, and in that way, the speaker would add, all sorts of things would come to light, and certain gentlemen would have to lay their cards on the table. In short, thousands of similar very absurd rumors were discussed. To keep it up, everyone believed the story at once, showed interest in it, asked questions, applied it to themselves, and some of them, assuming a despondent air, began shaking their heads and asking everyone's advice, saying what were they to do if they were to come under it. It need hardly be said that a man far less credulous and simple-hearted than Mr. Prohartchin would have been puzzled and carried away by a rumor so unanimously believed. Moreover, from all appearances, it might be safely concluded that Semyon Ivanovitch was exceedingly stupid and slow to grasp any new, unusual idea, and that when he heard anything new, he had always first, as it were, to chew it over and digest it, to find out the meaning, and struggling with it in bewilderment, at last, perhaps, to overcome it, though even then, in a quite special manner peculiar to himself alone. In this way, curious and hitherto unexpected qualities began to show themselves in Semyon Ivanovitch. Talk and tittle-tattle followed, and by devious ways it all reached the office at last, with additions. What increased the sensation was the fact that Mr. Prohartchin, who had looked almost exactly the same from time immemorial, suddenly, apropos of nothing, wore quite a different countenance. His face was uneasy, his eyes were timid, and had a scared and rather suspicious expression. He took to walking softly, starting and listening, and to put the finishing touch to his new characteristics, developed a passion for investigating the truth. He carried his love of truth at last to such a pitch as to venture, on 2 occasions, to inquire of Demid Vassilievitch himself concerning the credibility of the strange rumors that reached him daily by dozens, and if we say nothing here of the consequence of the action of Semyon Ivanovitch, it is for no other reason but a sensitive regard for his reputation. It was in this way people came to consider him as misanthropic and regardless of the proprieties. Then they began to discover that there was a great deal that was fantastical about him, and in this they were not altogether mistaken, for it was observed on more than one occasion that Semyon Ivanovitch completely forgot himself, and sitting in his seat with his mouth open and his pen in the air, as though frozen or petrified, looked more like the shadow of a rational being than that rational being itself. It sometimes happened that some innocently gaping gentleman, on suddenly catching his straying, lustreless, questioning eyes, was scared, and all of a tremor, and at once inserted into some important document either a smudge or some quite inappropriate word. The impropriety of Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior embarrassed and annoyed all really well-bred people. At last, no one could feel any doubt of the eccentricity of Semyon Ivanovitch's mind, when one fine morning the rumor was all over the office that Mr. Prohartchin had actually frightened Demid Vassilievitch himself, for meeting him in the corridor, Semyon Ivanovitch had been so strange and peculiar that he had forced his superior to beat a retreat. The news of Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior reached him himself at last. Hearing of it, he got up at once, made his way carefully between the chairs and tables, reached the entry, took down his overcoat with his own hand, put it on, went out, and disappeared for an indefinite period. Whether he was led into this by alarm or some other impulse we cannot say, but no trace was seen of him for a time either at home or at the office. We will not attribute Semyon Ivanovitch's fate simply to his eccentricity, yet we must observe to the reader that our hero was a very retiring man, unaccustomed to society, and had, until he made the acquaintance of the new lodgers, lived in complete unbroken solitude, and had been marked by his quietness and even a certain mysteriousness. For he had spent all the time that he lodged at Pesky lying on his bed behind the screen, without talking or having any sort of relations with anyone. Both his old fellow lodgers lived exactly as he did. They, too, were somehow mysterious people, and spent 15 years lying behind their screens. The happy, drowsy hours and days trailed by, one after the other, in patriarchal stagnation, and as everything around them went its way in the same happy fashion, neither Semyon Ivanovitch nor Ustinya Fyodorovna could remember exactly when fate had brought them together. It may be 10 years, it may be 20, it may be even 25 altogether, she would say at times to her new lodgers, since he settled with me, poor dear man, bless his heart. And so it was very natural that the hero of our story, being so unaccustomed to society, was disagreeably surprised when, a year before, he, a respectable and modest man, had found himself suddenly in the midst of a noisy and boisterous crew, consisting of a dozen young fellows, his colleagues at the office, and his new housemates. The disappearance of Semyon Ivanovitch made no little stir in the lodgings. One thing was that he was the favourite. Another, that his passport, which had been in the landlady's keeping, appeared to have been accidentally mislaid. Ustinya Fyodorovna raised a howl, as was her invariable habit on all critical occasions. She spent 2 days in abusing and upbraiding the lodgers. She wailed that they had chased away her lodger like a chicken, and all those spiteful scoffers had been the ruin of him. And on the 3rd day, she sent them all out to hunt for the fugitive and at all costs to bring him back, dead or alive. Towards evening, Sudbin first came back with the news that traces had been discovered, that he had himself seen the runaway in Tolkuchi Market and other places, had followed and stood close to him, but had not dared to speak to him. He had been near him in a crowd watching a house on fire in Crooked Lane. Half an hour later, Okeanov and Kantarev came in and confirmed Sudbin's story, word for word. They, too, had stood near, had followed him quite close, had stood not more than 10 paces from him, but they also had not ventured to speak to him, but both observed that Semyon Ivanovitch was walking with a drunken cadger. The other lodgers were all back and together at last, and after listening attentively, they made up their minds that Prohartchin could not be far off and would not be long in returning. But they said that they had all known beforehand that he was about with a drunken cadger. This drunken cadger was a thoroughly bad lot, insolent and cringing, and it seemed evident that he had got round Semyon Ivanovitch in some way. He had turned up just a week before Semyon Ivanovitch's disappearance in company with Remnev, had spent a little time in the flat, telling them that he had suffered in the cause of justice, that he had formerly been in the service in the provinces, that an inspector had come down on them, that he and his associates had somehow suffered in a good cause, that he had come to Petersburg and fallen at the feet of Porfiry Grigorievich, that he had been got, by interest, into a department. But through the cruel persecution of fate, he had been discharged from there too, and that afterwards, through reorganization, the office itself had ceased to exist, and that he had not been included in the new revised staff of clerks, owing as much to direct incapacity for official work as to capacity for something else quite irrelevant, all this mixed up with his passion for justice, and of course the trickery of his enemies. After finishing his story, in the course of which Mr. Zimoveykin more than once kissed his sullen and unshaven friend Remnev, he bowed down to all in the room in turn, not forgetting Avdotia the servant, called them all his benefactors, and explained that he was an undeserving, troublesome, mean, insolent, and stupid man, and that good people must not be hard on his pitiful plight and simplicity. After begging for their kind protection, Mr. Zimoveykin showed his livelier side, grew very cheerful, kissed Ustinya Fyodorovna's hands, in spite of her modest protests that her hand was coarse and not like a lady's, and towards evening promised to show the company his talent in a remarkable character dance. But next day his visit ended in a lamentable denouement, either because there had been too much character in the character dance, or because he had, in Ustinya Fyodorovna's own words, somehow insulted her and treated her as no lady, though she was on friendly terms with Yaroslav Ilyich himself, and if she liked might long ago have been an officer's wife. Zimoveykin had to steer for home next day. He went away, came back again, was again turned out with ignominy, then wormed his way into Semyon Ivanovitch's good graces, robbed him incidentally of his new breeches, and now it appeared he had led Semyon Ivanovitch astray. As soon as the landlady knew that Semyon Ivanovitch was alive and well, and that there was no need to hunt for his passport, she promptly left off grieving and was pacified. Meanwhile, some of the lodgers determined to give the runaway a triumphal reception. They broke the bolt and moved away the screen from Mr. Prohartchin's bed, rumpled up the bed a little, took the famous box, put it at the foot of the bed, and on the bed laid the sister-in-law, that is, a dummy made up of an old kerchief, a cap, and a mantle of the landlady's, such an exact counterfeit of a sister-in-law that it might have been mistaken for one. Having finished their work, they waited for Semyon Ivanovitch to return, meaning to tell him that his sister-in-law had arrived from the country and was there behind his screen, poor thing. But they waited and waited. Already, while they waited, Mark Ivanovitch had staked and lost half a month's salary to Prepolovenko and Kantarev. Already, Okeanov's nose had grown red and swollen, playing flips on the nose and 3 cards. Already, Avdotya the servant had almost had her sleep out and had twice been on the point of getting up to fetch the wood and light the stove, and Zinovy Prokofyevitch, who kept running out every minute to see whether Semyon Ivanovitch were coming, was wet to the skin. But there was no sign of anyone yet, neither Semyon Ivanovitch nor the drunken cadger. At last, everyone went to bed, leaving the sister-in-law behind the screen in readiness for any emergency. And it was not till 4 o'clock that a knock was heard at the gate, but when it did come, it was so loud that it quite made up to the expectant lodgers for all the wearisome trouble they had been through. It was he himself, Semyon Ivanovitch, Mr. Prohartchin, but in such a condition that they all cried out in dismay, and no one thought about the sister-in-law. The lost man was unconscious. He was brought in, or more correctly carried in, by a sopping and tattered night-cabman. To the landlady's question where the poor dear man had got so groggy, the cabman answered, "Why, he is not drunk, and has not had a drop, that I can tell you for sure, but seemingly a faintness has come over him, or some sort of a fit, or maybe he's been knocked down by a blow." They began examining him, propping the culprit against the stove to do so more conveniently, and saw that it really was not a case of drunkenness, nor had he had a blow, but that something else was wrong, for Semyon Ivanovitch could not utter a word, but seemed twitching in a sort of convulsion, and only blinked, fixing his eyes in bewilderment, first on one and then on another of the spectators, who were all attired in night array. Then they began questioning the cabman, asking where he had got him from. "Why, from folks out Kolomna way," he answered. "Deuce knows what they are, not exactly gentry, but merry, rollicking gentlemen. So he was like this when they gave him to me. Whether they had been fighting, or whether he was in some sort of a fit, goodness knows what it was. But they were nice, jolly gentlemen." Semyon Ivanovitch was taken, lifted high on the shoulders of 2 or 3 sturdy fellows, and carried to his bed. When Semyon Ivanovitch, on being put in bed, felt the sister-in-law, and put his feet on his sacred box, he cried out at the top of his voice, squatted up almost on his heels, and trembling and shaking all over, with his hands and his body, he cleared a space as far as he could in his bed, while gazing with a tremulous but strangely resolute look at those present, he seemed as it were to protest that he would sooner die than give up the 100th part of his poor belongings to anyone. Semyon Ivanovitch lay for 2 or 3 days closely barricaded by the screen, and so cut off from all the world and all its vain anxieties. Next morning, of course, everyone had forgotten about him. Time, meanwhile, flew by as usual. Hour followed hour and day followed day. The sick man's heavy, feverish brain was plunged in something between sleep and delirium, but he lay quietly and did not moan or complain. On the contrary, he kept still and silent and controlled himself, lying low in his bed, just as the hare lies close to the earth when it hears the hunter. At times, a long, depressing stillness prevailed in the flat, a sign that the lodgers had all gone to the office, and Semyon Ivanovitch, waking up, could relieve his depression by listening to the bustle in the kitchen, where the landlady was busy close by, or to the regular flop of Avdotya's downtrodden slippers, as, sighing and moaning, she cleared away, rubbed and polished, tidying all the rooms in the flat. Whole hours passed by in that way, drowsy, languid, sleepy, wearisome, like the water that dripped with a regular sound from the locker into the basin in the kitchen. At last, the lodgers would arrive, one by one or in groups, and Semyon Ivanovitch could very conveniently hear them abusing the weather, saying they were hungry, making a noise, smoking, quarrelling, and making friends, playing cards, and clattering the cups as they got ready for tea. Semyon Ivanovitch mechanically made an effort to get up and join them, as he had a right to do at tea. But he at once sank back into drowsiness and dreamed that he'd been sitting a long time at the tea-table, having tea with them and talking, and that Zinovy Prokofyevitch had already seized the opportunity to introduce into the conversation some scheme concerning sisters-in-law and the moral relation of various worthy people to them. At this point, Semyon Ivanovitch was in haste to defend himself and reply, but the mighty formula that flew from every tongue, it has more than once been observed, cut short all his objections, and Semyon Ivanovitch could do nothing better than begin dreaming again that today was the 1st of the month, and that he was receiving money in his office. Undoing the paper round it on the stairs, he looked about him quickly, and made haste as fast as he could to subtract half of the lawful wages he had received, and conceal it in his boot. Then, on the spot, on the stairs, quite regardless of the fact that he was in bed and asleep, he made up his mind when he reached home to give his landlady what was due for board and lodging, then to buy certain necessities, and to show anyone it might concern, as it were casually and unintentionally, that some of his salary had been deducted, that now he had nothing left to send his sister-in-law, then to speak with commiseration of his sister-in-law, to say a great deal about her the next day and the day after, and 10 days later to say something casually again about her poverty that his companions might not forget. Making this determination, he observed that Andrei Efimovitch, that everlastingly silent, bald little man who sat in the office 3 rooms from where Semyon Ivanovitch sat and hadn't said a word to him for 20 years, was standing on the stairs, that he too was counting his silver roubles and shaking his head. He said to him, "Money! If there's no money, there will be no porridge," he added grimly as he went down the stairs, and just at the door he ended, "And I have 7 children, sir." Then the little bald man, probably equally unconscious that he was acting as a phantom and not as a substantial reality, held up his hand about 30 inches from the floor, and waving it vertically, muttered that the eldest was going to school. Then, glancing with indignation at Semyon Ivanovitch, as though it were Mr. Prohartchin's fault that he was the father of 7, pulled his old hat down over his eyes, and with a whisk of his overcoat, he turned to the left and disappeared. Semyon Ivanovitch was quite frightened, and though he was fully convinced of his own innocence in regard to the unpleasant accumulation of 7 under one roof, yet it seemed to appear that, in fact, no one else was to blame but Semyon Ivanovitch. Panic-stricken, he set off running, for it seemed to him that the bald gentleman had turned back, was running after him, and meant to search him and take away all his salary, insisting upon the indisputable number 7, and resolutely denying any possible claim of any sort of sisters-in-law upon Semyon Ivanovitch. Prohartchin ran and ran, gasping for breath. Beside him was running, too, an immense number of people, and all of them were jingling their money in the tail pockets of their skimpy little dress coats. At last, everyone ran up. There was the noise of fire engines, and whole masses of people carried him almost on their shoulders up to that same house on fire which he had watched last time in company with the drunken cadger. The drunken cadger, alias Mr. Zimoveykin, was there now, too. He met Semyon Ivanovitch, made a fearful fuss, took him by the arm, and led him into the thickest part of the crowd. Just as then, in reality, all about them was the noise and uproar of an immense crowd of people, flooding the whole of Fontanka embankment between the two bridges, as well as all the surrounding streets and alleys. Just as then, Semyon Ivanovitch, in company with the drunken cadger, was carried along behind a fence, where they were squeezed as though in pincers in a huge timber yard full of spectators who had gathered from the street, from Tolkuchi market, and from all the surrounding houses, taverns, and restaurants. Semyon Ivanovitch saw all this, and felt as he had done at the time. In the whirl of fever and delirium, all sorts of strange figures began flitting before him. He remembered some of them. One of them was a gentleman who had impressed everyone extremely, a man 7 feet high, with whiskers half a yard long, who had been standing behind Semyon Ivanovitch's back during the fire, and had given him encouragement from behind, when our hero had felt something like ecstasy, and had stamped as though intending thereby to applaud the gallant work of the firemen, from which he had an excellent view from his elevated position. Another was the sturdy lad from whom our hero had received a shove by way of a lift onto another fence, when he had been disposed to climb over it, possibly to save someone. He had a glimpse, too, of the figure of the old man with a sickly face, in an old wadded dressing gown tied round the waist, who had made his appearance before the fire in a little shop, buying sugar and tobacco for his lodger, and who now, with a milk can and a quart pot in his hands, made his way through the crowd to the house in which his wife and daughter were burning together with 13.5 rubles in the corner under the bed. But most distinct of all was the poor, sinful woman of whom he had dreamed more than once during his illness. She stood before him now, as she had done then, in wretched bark shoes and rags, with a crutch and a wicker basket on her back. She was shouting more loudly than the firemen or the crowd, waving her crutch and her arms, saying that her own children had turned her out, and that she had lost 2 coppers in consequence. The children and the coppers and the children were mingled together in an utterly incomprehensible muddle, from which everyone withdrew baffled, after vain efforts to understand. But the woman would not desist. She kept wailing, shouting, and waving her arms, seeming to pay no attention either to the fire up to which she had been carried by the crowd from the street, or to the people about her, or to the misfortune of strangers, or even to the sparks and red-hot embers which were beginning to fall in showers on the crowd standing near. At last, Mr. Prohartchin felt that a feeling of terror was coming upon him, for he saw clearly that all this was not, so to say, an accident, and that he would not get off scot-free. And indeed, upon the woodstack, close to him, was a peasant in a torn smock that hung loose about him, with his hair and beard singed, and he began stirring up all the people against Semyon Ivanovitch. The crowd pressed closer and closer, the peasant shouted, and foaming at the mouth with horror, Mr. Prohartchin suddenly realized that this peasant was a cabman whom he had cheated 5 years before in the most inhuman way, slipping away from him without paying through a side gate and jerking up his heels as he ran as though he were barefoot on hot bricks. In despair, Mr. Prohartchin tried to speak, to scream, but his voice failed him. He felt that the infuriated crowd was twining round him like a many-coloured snake, strangling him, crushing him. He made an incredible effort and awoke. Then he saw that he was on fire, that all his corner was on fire, that his screen was on fire, that the whole flat was on fire, together with Ustinya Fyodorovna and all her lodgers, that his bed was burning, his pillow, his quilt, his box, and last of all, his precious mattress. Semyon Ivanovitch jumped up, clutched at the mattress, and ran, dragging it after him. But in the landlady's room, into which, regardless of decorum, our hero ran just as he was, barefoot and in his shirt, he was seized, held tight, and triumphantly carried back behind the screen, which meanwhile was not on fire. It seemed that it was rather Semyon Ivanovitch's head that was on fire, and was put back to bed. It was just as some tattered, unshaven, ill-humoured organ grinder puts away in his travelling box the punch who has been making an upset, drubbing all the other puppets, selling his soul to the devil, and who at last ends his existence, till the next performance, in the same box with the devil, the Negroes, the Pierrot, and Mademoiselle Katerina, with her fortunate lover, the captain. Immediately everyone, old and young, surrounded Semyon Ivanovitch, standing in a row round his bed and fastening eyes full of expectation on the invalid. Meantime he had come to himself, but from shame or some other feeling began pulling up the quilt over him, apparently wishing to hide himself under it from the attention of his sympathetic friends. At last, Mark Ivanovitch was the first to break silence, and as a sensible man, he began saying in a very friendly way that Semyon Ivanovitch must keep calm, that it was too bad and a shame to be ill, that only little children behaved like that he must get well and go to the office. Mark Ivanovitch ended by a little joke, saying that no regular salary had yet been fixed for invalids, and as he knew for a fact that their grade would be very low in the service, to his thinking anyway, their calling or condition did not promise great and substantial advantages. In fact, it was evident that they were all taking genuine interest in Semyon Ivanovitch's fate, and were very sympathetic. But with incomprehensible rudeness, Semyon Ivanovitch persisted in lying in bed in silence and obstinately pulling the quilt higher and higher over his head. Mark Ivanovitch, however, would not be gainsaid, and restraining his feelings, said something very honey to Semyon Ivanovitch again, knowing that that was how he ought to treat a sick man. But Semyon Ivanovitch would not feel this. On the contrary, he muttered something between his teeth with the most distrustful air, and suddenly began glancing askance from right to left in a hostile way, as though he would have reduced his sympathetic friends to ashes with his eyes. It was no use letting it stop there. Mark Ivanovitch lost patience, and seeing that the man was offended and completely exasperated, and had simply made up his mind to be obstinate, told him straight out, without any softening suavity, that it was time to get up, that it was no use lying there. That shouting day and night about houses on fire, sisters-in-law, drunken cadgers, locks, boxes, and goodness knows what, was all stupid, improper, and degrading. For if Semyon Ivanovitch did not want to sleep himself, he should not hinder other people, and please would he bear it in mind. This speech produced its effects, for Semyon Ivanovitch, turning promptly to the orator, articulated firmly, though in a hoarse voice, "You hold your tongue, puppy. You idle speaker, you foul-mouthed man. Do you hear, young dandy? Are you a prince, eh? Do you understand what I say?" Hearing such insults, Mark Ivanovitch fired up, but realizing that he had to deal with a sick man, magnanimously overcame his resentment and tried to shame him out of his humor, but was cut short in that too. For Semyon Ivanovitch observed at once that he would not allow people to play with him for all that Mark Ivanovitch wrote poetry. Then followed a silence of 2 minutes. At last, recovering from his amazement, Mark Ivanovitch, plainly, clearly, in well-chosen language, but with firmness, declared that Semyon Ivanovitch ought to understand that he was among gentlemen, and, "You ought to understand, sir, how to behave with gentlemen." Mark Ivanovitch could on occasion speak effectively and liked to impress his hearers, but probably from the habit of years of silence, Semyon Ivanovitch talked and acted somewhat abruptly, and moreover, when he did on occasion begin a long sentence, as he got further into it, every word seemed to lead to another word, that other word to a third word, that third to a fourth, and so on, so that his mouth seemed brimming over. He began stuttering, and the crowding words took to flying out in picturesque disorder. That was why Semyon Ivanovitch, who was a sensible man, sometimes talked terrible nonsense. "You are lying," he said now. "You booby, you loose fellow. You'll come to want. You'll go begging, you seditious fellow. You loafer. Take that, you poet. Why, you are still raving, aren't you, Semyon Ivanovitch?" "I tell you what," answered Semyon Ivanovitch, "fools rave, drunkards rave, dogs rave, but a wise man acts sensibly. I tell you, you don't know your own business, you loafer, you educated gentleman, you learned book. Here, you'll get on fire and not notice your head's burning off. What do you think of that?" "Why, you mean—" "How do you mean, burn my head off, Semyon Ivanovitch?" Mark Ivanovitch said no more, for everyone saw clearly that Semyon Ivanovitch was not yet in his sober senses, but delirious. But the landlady could not resist remarking at this point that the house in Crooked Lane had been burnt owing to a bald wench, that there was a bald-headed wench living there, that she had lighted a candle and set fire to the lumber room. But nothing would happen in her place, and everything would be all right in the flats. "But look here, Semyon Ivanovitch," cried Zinovy Prokofyevitch, losing patience and interrupting the landlady. "You old fogey, you old crock, you silly fellow. Are they making jokes with you now about your sister-in-law or examinations in dancing? Is that it? Is that what you think?" "Now, I tell you what," answered our hero, sitting up in bed and making a last effort in a paroxysm of fury with his sympathetic friends. "Who's the fool? You are the fool. A dog is a fool, you joking gentleman. But I'm not going to make jokes to please you, sir. Do you hear, puppy? I'm not your servant, sir." Semyon Ivanovitch would have said something more, but he fell back in bed, helpless. His sympathetic friends were left gaping in perplexity, for they understood now what was wrong with Semyon Ivanovitch, and did not know how to begin. Suddenly, the kitchen door creaked and opened, and the drunken cadger, alias Mr. Zimoveykin, timidly thrust in his head, cautiously sniffing round the place as his habit was. It seemed as though he had been expected. Everyone waved to him at once to come quickly, and Zimoveykin, highly delighted, with the utmost readiness and haste, jostled his way to Semyon Ivanovitch's bedside. It was evident that Zimoveykin had spent the whole night in vigil and in great exertions of some sort. The right side of his face was plastered up. His swollen eyelids were wet from his running eyes. His coat and all his clothes were torn, while the whole left side of his attire was bespattered with something extremely nasty, possibly mud from a puddle. Under his arm was somebody's violin, which he had been taking somewhere to sell. Apparently, they had not made a mistake in summoning him to their assistance, for seeing the position of affairs, he addressed the delinquent at once, and with the air of a man who knows what he is about and feels that he has the upper hand, said, "What are you thinking about? Get up, Senka. What are you doing? A clever chap like you? Be sensible, or I shall pull you out of bed if you are obstreperous. Don't be obstreperous." This brief but forcible speech surprised them all. Still more were they surprised when they noticed that Semyon Ivanovitch, hearing all this and seeing this person before him, was so flustered and reduced to such confusion and dismay that he could scarcely mutter through his teeth in a whisper the inevitable protest. "Go away, you wretch," he said. "You are a wretched creature. You are a thief. Do you hear? Do you understand? You are a great swell, my fine gentleman. You regular swell." "No, my boy," Zimoveykin answered emphatically, retaining all his presence of mind. "You're wrong there, you wise fellow. You regular Prohartchin," Zimoveykin went on, parodying Semyon Ivanovitch and looking round gleefully. "Don't be obstreperous. Behave yourself, Senka. Behave yourself, or I'll give you away. I'll tell them all about it, my lad. Do you understand?" Apparently, Semyon Ivanovitch did understand, for he started when he heard the conclusion of the speech and began looking rapidly about him with an utterly desperate air. Satisfied with the effect, Mr. Zimoveykin would have continued, but Mark Ivanovitch checked his zeal, and waiting till Semyon Ivanovitch was still and almost calm again, began judiciously impressing on the uneasy invalid at great length that, to harbour ideas such as he now had in his head, was first useless, and secondly, not only useless, but harmful, and, in fact, not so much harmful as positively immoral. And the cause of it all was that Semyon Ivanovitch was not only a bad example, but led them all into temptation. Everyone expected satisfactory results from this speech. Moreover, by now, Semyon Ivanovitch was quite quiet and replied in measured terms. A quiet discussion followed. They appealed to him in a friendly way, inquiring what he was so frightened of. Semyon Ivanovitch answered, but his answers were irrelevant. They answered him, he answered them. There were one or two more observations on both sides, and then everyone rushed into discussion, for suddenly such a strange and amazing subject cropped up that they did not know how to express themselves. The argument at last led to impatience. Impatience led to shouting, and shouting even to tears. And Mark Ivanovitch went away at last, foaming at the mouth, and declaring that he had never known such a blockhead. Oplavaniev spat in disgust. Okeanov was frightened. Zinovy Prokofyevitch became tearful, while Ustinya Fyodorovna positively howled, wailing that her lodger was leaving them and had gone off his head, that he would die, poor dear man, without a passport and without telling anyone, while she was a lone, lorn woman, and that she would be dragged from pillar to post. In fact, they all saw clearly at last that the seed they had sown had yielded 100-fold, that the soil had been too productive, and that in their company Semyon Ivanovitch had succeeded in overstraining his wits completely and in the most irrevocable manner. Everyone subsided into silence, for though they saw that Semyon Ivanovitch was frightened, the sympathetic friends were frightened too. "What?" cried Mark Ivanovitch. "But what are you afraid of? What have you gone off your head about? Who's thinking about you, my good sir? Have you the right to be afraid? Who are you? What are you?" "Nothing, sir. A round naught, sir, that is what you are. What are you making a fuss about? A woman has been run over in the street, so are you going to be run over? Some drunkard did not take care of his pocket, but is that any reason why your coat-tails should be cut off? A house is burnt down, so your head is to be burnt off, is it? Is that it, sir? Is that it?" You stupid," muttered Semyon Ivanovitch. "If your nose were cut off, you would eat it up with a bit of bread and not notice it." "I may be a dandy," shouted Mark Ivanovitch, not listening. "I may be a regular dandy, but I have not to pass an examination to get married, to learn dancing. The ground is firm under me, sir." "Why, my good man, haven't you room enough? Is the floor giving way under your feet, or what?" "Well, they won't ask you, will they? They'll shut one up, and that will be the end of it?" "The end of it? That's what's up. What's your idea now, eh?" "Why, they kicked out the drunken cadger." "Yes, but you see that was a drunkard, and you are a man, and so am I." "Yes, I am a man. It's there all right one day, and then it's gone." "Gone? But what do you mean by it?" "Why, the office! The office!" "Yes, you blessed man, but of course the office is wanted and necessary." "It is wanted, I tell you. It's wanted today and it's wanted tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow it will not be wanted. You have heard what happened?" "Why, but they'll pay you your salary for the year, you doubting Thomas, you man of little faith. They'll put you into another job on account of your age." "Salary? But what if I have spent my salary, if thieves come and take my money? And I have a sister-in-law, do you hear? A sister-in-law, you battering ram. A sister-in-law? You are a man." "Yes, I am. I am a man. But you are a well-read gentleman and a fool, do you hear? You battering ram. You regular battering ram. That's what you are. I'm not talking about your jokes, but there are jobs such that all of a sudden they are done away with. And Demid, do you hear? Demid Vasilievich says that the post will be done away with. Ah, bless you with your demid, you sinner, why, you know. In a twinkling of an eye you'll be left without a post, then you'll just have to make the best of it. Why, you are simply raving, or clean off your head. Tell us plainly, what have you done? Own up if you have done something wrong. It's no use being ashamed. Are you off your head, my good man, eh? He's off his head. He's gone off his head, they all cried, and wrung their hands in despair, while the landlady threw both her arms round Mark Ivanovitch for fear he should tear Semyon Ivanovitch to pieces. You heathen, you heathenish soul, you wise man, Zimoveykin besought him. Senka, you are not a man to take offence. You are a polite, prepossessing man. You are simple. You are good. Do you hear? It all comes from your goodness. Here I am a ruffian and a fool. I am a beggar. But good people haven't abandoned me, no fear. You see, they treat me with respect. I thank them and the landlady. Here, you see, I bow down to the ground to them. Here, see, I am paying what is due to you, landlady. At this point, Zimoveykin swung off with pedantic dignity, a low bow right down to the ground. After that, Semyon Ivanovitch would have gone on talking, but this time they would not let him. They all intervened, began entreating him, assuring him, comforting him, and succeeded in making Semyon Ivanovitch thoroughly ashamed of himself, and at last, in a faint voice, he asked leave to explain himself. Very well, then, he said. I am prepossessing. I am quiet. I am good, faithful, and devoted. To the last drop of my blood, you know. Do you hear, you puppy, you swell? Granted the job is going on, but you see I am poor. And what if they take it? Do you hear, you swell? Hold your tongue and try to understand. They'll take it, and that's all about it. It's going on, brother, and they're not going on. Do you understand? And I shall go begging my bread. Do you hear? Senka, Zimoveykin bawled frantically, drowning the general hubbub with his voice. You are seditious. I'll inform against you. What are you saying? Who are you? Are you a rebel, you sheep's head? A rowdy, stupid man they would turn off without a character. But what are you? Well, that's just it. What? Well, there it is. How do you mean? Why, I am free, he's free, and here one lies and thinks. What? What if they say I'm seditious? Si, di, Tius, Senka, you seditious! Stay, cried Mr. Prohartchin, waving his hand and interrupting the rising uproar. That's not what I mean. Try to understand, only try to understand, you sheep. I am law-abiding. I am law-abiding today. I am law-abiding tomorrow. And then all of a sudden they kick me out and call me seditious. What are you saying? Mark Ivanovitch thundered at last, jumping up from the chair on which he had sat down to rest, running up to the bed, and in a frenzy shaking with vexation and fury. What do you mean? You sheep! You've nothing to call your own. Why, are you the only person in the world? Was the world made for you, do you suppose? Are you a Napoleon? What are you? Who are you? Are you a Napoleon, eh? Tell me, are you a Napoleon? But Mr. Prohartchin did not answer this question, not because he was overcome with shame at being a Napoleon and was afraid of taking upon himself such a responsibility. No, he was incapable of disputing further or saying anything. His illness had reached a crisis. Tiny teardrops gushed suddenly from his glittering, feverish grey eyes. He hid his burning head in his bony hands that were wasted by illness, sat up in bed, and sobbing, began to say that he was quite poor, that he was a simple, unlucky man, that he was foolish and unlearned. He begged kind folks to forgive him, to take care of him, to protect him, to give him food and drink, not to leave him in want, and goodness knows what else Semyon Ivanovitch said. As he uttered this appeal, he looked about him in wild terror, as though he were expecting the ceiling to fall or the floor to give way. Everyone felt his heart soften and move to pity as he looked at the poor fellow. The landlady, sobbing and wailing like a peasant woman at her forlorn condition, laid the invalid back in bed with her own hands. Mark Ivanovich, seeing the uselessness of touching upon the memory of Napoleon, instantly relapsed into kindliness and came to her assistance. The others, in order to do something, suggested raspberry tea, saying that it always did good at once and that the invalid would like it very much. But Zimoveykin contradicted them all, saying there was nothing better than a good dose of chamomile or something of the sort. As for Zinovy Prokofyevitch, having a good heart, he sobbed and shed tears in his remorse for having frightened Semyon Ivanovitch with all sorts of absurdities, and gathering from the invalid's last words that he was quite poor and needing assistance, he proceeded to get up a subscription for him, confining it for a time to the tenants of the flat. Everyone was sighing and moaning. Everyone felt sorry and grieved, and yet all wondered how it was a man could be so completely panic-stricken. And what was he frightened about? It would have been all very well if he had had a good post, had had a wife, a lot of children. It would have been excusable if he were being hauled up before the court on some charge or other. But he was a man utterly insignificant, with nothing but a trunk and a German lock. He had been lying more than 20 years behind his screen, saying nothing, knowing nothing of the world nor of trouble, saving his halfpence, and now at a frivolous, idle word the man had actually gone off his head, was utterly panic-stricken at the thought he might have a hard time of it. And it never occurred to him that everyone has a hard time of it. If he would only take that into consideration, Okeanov said afterwards, that we all have a hard time, then the man would have kept his head, would have given up his antics, and would have put up with things, one way or another. All day long, nothing was talked of but Semyon Ivanovitch. They went up to him, inquired after him, tried to comfort him, but by the evening he was beyond that. The poor fellow began to be delirious, feverish. He sank into unconsciousness, so that they almost thought of sending for a doctor. The lodgers all agreed together and undertook to watch over Semyon Ivanovitch and soothe him by turns through the night, and if anything happened to wake all the rest immediately. With the object of keeping awake, they sat down to cards, setting beside the invalid his friend, the drunken cadger, who had spent the whole day in the flat and had asked leave to stay the night. As the game was played on credit and was not at all interesting, they soon got bored. They gave up the game, then got into an argument about something, then began to be loud and noisy, finally dispersed to their various corners, went on for a long time, angrily shouting and wrangling, and as all of them felt suddenly ill-humored, they no longer cared to sit up, so went to sleep. Soon it was as still in the flat as in an empty cellar, and it was the more like one because it was horribly cold. The last to fall asleep was Okeanov, and it was between sleeping and waking, as he said afterwards. I fancied just before morning 2 men kept talking close by me. Okeanov said that he recognized Zimoveykin, and that Zimoveykin began waking his old friend Remnev just beside him, that they talked for a long time in a whisper. Then Zimoveykin went away and could be heard trying to unlock the door into the kitchen. The key, the landlady declared afterwards, was lying under her pillow and was lost that night. Finally, Okeanov testified, he had fancied he had heard them go behind the screen to the invalid and light a candle there. And I know nothing more, he said. I fell asleep and woke up, as everybody else did, when everyone in the flat jumped out of bed at the sound behind the screen of a shriek that would have roused the dead, and it seemed to many of them that a candle went out at that moment. A great hubbub arose. Everyone's heart stood still. They rushed pell-mell at the shriek, but at that moment there was a scuffle, with shouting, swearing, and fighting. They struck a light and saw that. Zimoveykin and Remnev were fighting together, that they were swearing and abusing one another, and as they turned the light on them, one of them shouted, "It's not me, it's this ruffian," and the other, who was Zimoveykin, was shouting, "Don't touch me, I've done nothing. I'll take my oath any minute." Both of them looked hardly like human beings, but for the first minute they had no attention to spare for them. The invalid was not where he had been behind the screen. They immediately parted the combatants and dragged them away, and saw that Mr. Prohartchin was lying under the bed, He must, while completely unconscious, have dragged the quilt and pillow after him so that there was nothing left on the bedstead but the bare mattress, old and greasy. He never had sheets. They pulled Semyon Ivanovitch out, stretched him on the mattress, but soon realized that there was no need to make trouble over him, that he was completely done for. His arms were stiff, and he seemed all to pieces. They stood over him. He still faintly shuddered and trembled all over, made an effort to do something with his arms, could not utter a word, but blinked his eyes as they say heads do when still warm and bleeding after being just chopped off by the executioner. At last the body grew more and more still. The last faint convulsions died away. Mr. Prohartchin had set off with his good deeds and his sins. Whether Semyon Ivanovitch had been frightened by something, whether he had had a dream, as Remnev maintained afterwards, or there had been some other mischief, nobody knew. All that can be said is that if the head clerk had made his appearance at that moment in the flat and had announced that Semyon Ivanovitch was dismissed for sedition, insubordination, and drunkenness, if some old draggle-tailed beggar woman had come in at the door, calling herself Semyon Ivanovitch's sister-in-law, or if Semyon Ivanovitch had just received 200 rubles as a reward, or if the house had caught fire and Semyon Ivanovitch's head had been really burning, he would in all probability not have deigned to stir a finger in any of these eventualities. While the first stupefaction was passing over, while all present were regaining their powers of speech, were working themselves up into a fever of excitement, shouting and flying to conjectures and suppositions, while Ustinya Fyodorovna was pulling the box from under his bed, was rummaging in a fluster under the mattress, and even in Semyon Ivanovitch's boots, while they cross-questioned Remnev and Zimoveykin, Okeanov, who had hitherto been the quietest, humblest, and least original of the lodgers, suddenly plucked up all his presence of mind and displayed all his latent talents by taking up his hat and under cover of the general uproar slipping out of the flat. And just when the horrors of disorder and anarchy had reached their height in the agitated flat, till then so tranquil, the door opened, and suddenly there descended upon them, like snow upon their heads, a personage of gentlemanly appearance, with a severe and displeased-looking face. Behind him, Yaroslav Ilyitch. Behind Yaroslav Ilyitch, his subordinates and the functionaries whose duty it is to be present on such occasions, and behind them all, much embarrassed, Mr. Okeanov. The severe-looking personage of gentlemanly appearance went straight up to Semyon Ivanovitch, examined him, made a wry face, shrugged his shoulders, and announced what everybody knew, that is, that the dead man was dead, only adding that the same thing had happened a day or two ago to a gentleman of consequence, highly respected, who had died suddenly in his sleep. Then the personage of gentlemanly but displeased-looking appearance walked away, saying that they had troubled him for nothing, and took himself off. His place was at once filled, while Remnev and Zimoveykin were handed over to the custody of the proper functionaries, by Yaroslav Ilyitch, who questioned someone, adroitly took possession of the box, which the landlady was already trying to open, put the boots back in their proper place, observing that they were all in holes and no use, asked for the pillow to be put back, called up Okeanov, asked for the key of the box which was found in the pocket of the drunken cadger, and solemnly, in the presence of the proper officials, unlocked Semyon Ivanovitch's property. Everything was displayed. 2 rags, a pair of socks, half a handkerchief, an old hat, several buttons, some old soles, and the uppers of a pair of boots, that is, all sorts of odds and ends, scraps, rubbish, trash, which had a stale smell. The only thing of any value was the German lock. They called up Okeanov and cross-questioned him sternly, but Okeanov was ready to take his oath. They asked for the pillow. They examined it. It was extremely dirty, but in other respects it was like all other pillows. They attacked the mattress. They were about to lift it up, but stopped for a moment's consideration, when suddenly and quite unexpectedly something heavy fell with a clink on the floor. They bent down and saw on the floor a screw of paper, and in the screw some 12 rubles. "Ah, hey!" said Yaroslav Ilyich, pointing to a slit in the mattress from which hair and stuffing were sticking out. They examined the slit and found that it had only just been made with a knife and was half a yard in length. They thrust hands into the gap and pulled out a kitchen knife, probably hurriedly thrust in there after slitting the mattress. Before Yaroslav Ilyich had time to pull the knife out of the slit and to say, "Hey, hey!" Again, another screw of money fell out, and after it, one at a time, 2 half-rubles, a quarter-ruble, then some small change, and an old-fashioned, solid 5-kopeck piece. All this was seized upon. At this point it was realized that it would not be amiss to cut up the whole mattress with scissors. They asked for scissors. Meanwhile, the guttering candle lighted up a scene that would have been extremely curious to a spectator. About a dozen lodgers were grouped round the bed in the most picturesque costumes, all unbrushed, unshaven, unwashed, sleepy-looking, just as they had gone to bed. Some were quite pale, while others had drops of sweat upon their brows. Some were shuddering, while others looked feverish. The landlady, utterly stupefied, was standing quietly with her hands folded, waiting for Yaroslav Ilyich's good pleasure. From the stove above, the heads of Avdotia, the servant, and the landlady's favourite cat looked down with frightened curiosity. The torn and broken screen lay cast on the floor. The open box displayed its uninviting contents. The quilt and pillow lay tossed at random, covered with fluff from the mattress, and on the 3-legged wooden table gleamed the steadily growing heap of silver and other coins. Only Semyon Ivanovitch preserved his composure, lying calmly on the bed and seeming to have no foreboding of his ruin. When the scissors had been brought, and Yaroslav Ilyich's assistant, wishing to be of service, shook the mattress rather impatiently to ease it from under the back of its owner, Semyon Ivanovitch, with his habitual civility, made room a little, rolling on his side with his back to the searchers. Then, at a second shake, he turned on his face, finally gave way still further, and as the last slat in the bedstead was missing, he suddenly and quite unexpectedly plunged head downward, leaving in view only 2 bony, thin, blue legs, which stuck upwards like 2 branches of a charred tree. As this was the second time that morning that Mr. Prohartchin had poked his head under his bed, it at once aroused suspicion, and some of the lodgers, headed by Zinovy Prokofyevitch, crept under it, with the intention of seeing whether there were something hidden there too. But they knocked their heads together for nothing, and as Yaroslav Ilyich shouted to them, bidding them release Semyon Ivanovitch at once from his unpleasant position, 2 of the more sensible seized each a leg, dragged the unsuspected capitalist into the light of day, and laid him across the bed. Meanwhile, the hare and flock were flying about, the heap of silver grew, and my goodness, what a lot there was. Noble silver rubles, stout solid rouble and a half pieces, pretty half-ruble coins, plebeian quarter-rubles, 20-kopeck pieces, even the unpromising old crone's small fry of 10 and 5-kopeck silver pieces, all done up in separate bits of paper in the most methodical and systematic way. There were curiosities also, 2 counters of some sort, 1 Napoleon d'Or, 1 very rare coin of some unknown kind. Some of the roubles were of the greatest antiquity. They were rubbed and hacked coins of Elizabeth, German kreutzers, coins of Peter, of Catherine. There were, for instance, old 15-kopeck pieces, now very rare, pierced for wearing as earrings, all much worn, yet with the requisite number of dots. There was even copper, but all of that was green and tarnished. They found 1 red note, but no more. At last, when the dissection was quite over, and the mattress case had been shaken more than once without a clink, they piled all the money on the table and set to work to count it. At the first glance, one might well have been deceived and have estimated it at 1,000,000. It was such an immense heap. But it was not 1,000,000, though it did turn out to be a very considerable sum, exactly 24.97 roubles and a half, so that if Zinovy Prokofyevitch's subscription had been raised the day before, there would perhaps have been just 2,500 roubles. They took the money, they put a seal on the dead man's box, They listened to the landlady's complaints and informed her when and where she ought to lodge information in regard to the dead man's little debt to her. A receipt was taken from the proper person. At that point, hints were dropped in regard to the sister-in-law, but being persuaded that in a certain sense the sister-in-law was a myth, that is, a product of the defective imagination with which they had more than once reproached Semyon Ivanovitch, they abandoned the idea as useless, mischievous, and disadvantageous to the good name of Mr. Prohartchin, and so the matter ended. When the first shock was over, when the lodgers had recovered themselves and realized the sort of person their late companion had been, they all subsided, relapsed into silence, and began looking distrustfully at one another. Some seemed to take Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior very much to heart, and even to feel affronted by it. What a fortune! So the man had saved up like this. Not losing his composure, Mark Ivanovitch proceeded to explain why Semyon Ivanovitch had been so suddenly panic-stricken, but they did not listen to him. Zinovy Prokofyevitch was very thoughtful. Okeanov had had a little to drink. The others seemed rather crestfallen, while a little man called Kantarev, with a nose like a sparrow's beak, left the flat that evening after very carefully packing up and cording all his boxes and bags, and coldly explaining to the curious that times were hard and that the terms here were beyond his means. The landlady wailed without ceasing, lamenting for Semyon Ivanovitch and cursing him for having taken advantage of her lorn state. Mark Ivanovitch was asked why the dead man had not taken his money to the bank. "He was too simple, my good soul. He hadn't enough imagination," answered Mark Ivanovitch. "Yes, and you have been too simple too, my good woman," Okeanov put in. "For 20 years the man kept himself close here in your flat, and here he's been knocked down by a feather, while you went on cooking cabbage soup and had no time to notice it. Ah, my good woman." "Oh, the poor dear," the landlady went on. "What need of a bank? If he'd brought me his pile and said to me, 'Take it, Ustinyushka, poor dear. Here is all I have. Keep and board me in my helplessness, so long as I am on earth.' Then, by the holy icon, I would have fed him. I would have given him drink. I would have looked after him. Ah, the sinner. Ah, the deceiver. He deceived me. He cheated me, a poor lone woman." They went up to the bed again. Semyon Ivanovitch was lying properly now, dressed in his best, though, indeed, it was his only suit, hiding his rigid chin behind a cravat, which was tied rather awkwardly, washed, brushed, but not quite shaven, because there was no razor in the flat. The only one, which had belonged to Zinovy Prokofyevitch, had lost its edge a year ago, and had been very profitably sold at Tolkuchi market. The others used to go to the barber's. They had not yet had time to clear up the disorder. The broken screen lay as before, and exposing Semyon Ivanovitch's seclusion seemed like an emblem of the fact that death tears away the veil from all our secrets, our shifty dodges and intrigues. The stuffing from the mattress lay about in heaps. The whole room, suddenly so still, might well have been compared by a poet to the ruined nest of a swallow. Broken down and torn to pieces by the storm, the nestlings and their mother killed, and their warm little bed of fluff, feather and flock scattered about them. Semyon Ivanovitch, however, looked more like a conceited, thievish old cock-sparrow. He kept quite quiet now, seemed to be lying low, as though he were not guilty, as though he had had nothing to do with the shameless, conscienceless, and unseemly duping and deception of all these good people. He did not heed now the sobs and wailing of his bereaved and wounded landlady. On the contrary, like a wary, callous capitalist, anxious not to waste a minute in idleness even in the coffin, he seemed to be wrapped up in some speculative calculation. There was a look of deep reflection in his face, while his lips were drawn together with a significant air, of which Semyon Ivanovitch, during his lifetime, had not been suspected of being capable. He seemed, as it were, to have grown shrewder. His right eye was, as it were, slyly screwed up. Semyon Ivanovitch seemed wanting to say something, to make some very important communication and explanation, and without loss of time, because things were complicated, and there was not a minute to lose. and it seemed as though they could hear him. "What is it? Give over, do you hear, you stupid woman? Don't whine. Go to bed and sleep it off, my good woman, do you hear? I am dead. There's no need of a fuss now. What's the use of it, really? It's nice to lie here. Though I don't mean that, do you hear? You are a fine lady. You are a regular fine lady. Understand that. Here I am dead now. But look here. What if? That is, perhaps it can't be so. But I say, what if I'm not dead? What if I get up? Do you hear? What would happen then?" The Grand Inquisitor by Fyodor Dostoevsky. "Quite impossible, as you see, to start without an introduction," laughed Ivan. "Well then, I mean to place the event described in the poem in the 16th century, an age, as you must have been told at school, when it was the great fashion among poets to make the denizens and powers of higher worlds descend on earth and mix freely with mortals. In France, all the notaries' clerks, and the monks in the cloisters as well, used to give grand performances, dramatic plays in which long scenes were enacted by the Madonna, the angels, the saints, Christ, and even by God himself. In those days, everything was very artless and primitive. An instance of it may be found in Victor Hugo's drama, Notre-Dame de Paris, where, at the Municipal Hall, a play called Le Bon Jugement de la Très Sainte et Gracieuse Vierge Marie is enacted in honor of Louis V, in which the Virgin appears personally to pronounce her good judgment. In Moscow, during the Propetrian period, performances of nearly the same character, chosen especially from the Old Testament, were also in great favor. Apart from such plays, the world was overflooded with mystical writings, verses, the heroes of which were always selected from the ranks of angels, saints, and other heavenly citizens, answering to the devotional purposes of the age. The recluses of our monasteries, like the Roman Catholic monks, passed their time in translating, copying, and even producing original compositions upon such subjects, and that remember during the Tartar period. In this connection, I am reminded of a poem compiled in a convent, a translation from the Greek, of course, called The Travels of the Mother of God Among the Damned, with fitting illustrations and a boldness of conception inferior nowise to that of Dante. The Mother of God visits hell, in company with the Archangel Michael as her cicerone to guide her through the legions of the damned. She sees them all, and is witness to their multifarious tortures. Among the many other exceedingly remarkably varieties of torments, every category of sinners having its own, there is one especially worthy of notice, namely a class of the damned, sentenced to gradually sink in a burning lake of brimstone and fire. Those whose sins cause them to sink so low that they no longer can rise to the surface are forever forgotten by God. That is, they fade out from the omniscient memory, says the poem, an expression, by the way, of an extraordinary profundity of thought when closely analyzed. The Virgin is terribly shocked, and falling down upon her knees in tears before the throne of God, begs that all she has seen in hell, all without exception, should have their sentences remitted to them. Her dialogue with God is colossally interesting. She supplicates she will not leave him. And when God, pointing to the pierced hands and feet of her Son, cries, "How can I forgive his executioners?" She then commands that all the saints, martyrs, angels, and archangels should prostrate themselves with her before the immutable and changeless one and implore him to change his wrath into mercy and forgive them all. The poem closes upon her obtaining from God a compromise, a kind of yearly respite of tortures between Good Friday and Trinity, a chorus of the damned singing loud praises to God from their bottomless pit, thanking and telling him, "Thou art right, O Lord, very right. Thou hast condemned us justly." My poem is of the same character. In it, it is Christ who appears on the scene. True, he says nothing, but only appears and passes out of sight. 15 centuries have elapsed since he left the world with the distinct promise to return with power and great glory. 15 long centuries since his prophet cried, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." Since he himself had foretold, while yet on earth, of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But Christendom expects him still. It waits for him with the same old faith and the same emotion. Aye, with a far greater faith, for 15 centuries have rolled away since the last sign from heaven was sent to man, and blind faith remained alone, to lull the trusting heart, as heaven would send a sign no more. True, again, we have all heard of miracles being wrought ever since the age of miracles, passed away to return no more. We had, and still have, our saints credited with performing the most miraculous cures. And if we can believe their biographers, there have been those among them who have been personally visited by the Queen of Heaven. But Satan sleepeth not, and the first germs of doubt and ever-increasing unbelief in such wonders already had begun to sprout in Christendom as early as the 16th century. It was just at that time that a new and terrible heresy first made its appearance in the north of Germany. Luther's reform, a great star, shining as it were a lamp, fell upon the fountain's waters, and they were made bitter. This heresy blasphemously denied miracles. But those who had remained faithful believed all the more ardently. The tears of mankind ascended to him as heretofore, and the Christian world was expecting him as confidently as ever. They loved him and hoped in him, thirsted and hungered to suffer and die for him, just as many of them had done before. So many centuries had weak, trusting humanity implored him, crying with ardent faith and fervour, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not come?" So many long centuries hath it vainly appealed to him that at last, in his inexhaustible compassion, he consenteth to answer the prayer. He decideth that once more, if it were but for one short hour, the people, his long-suffering, tortured, fatally sinful, his loving and childlike, trusting people, shall behold him again. The scene of action is placed by me in Spain, at Seville, during that terrible period of the Inquisition, when, for the greater glory of God, stakes were flaming all over the country. Burning wicked heretics in grand auto-da-fés. This particular visit has, of course, nothing to do with the promised Advent, when, according to the program, after the tribulation of those days, he will appear coming in the clouds of heaven. For that coming of the Son of Man, as we are informed, will take place as suddenly as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west. No, this once he desired to come unknown and appear among his children, just when the bones of the heretics, sentenced to be burnt alive, had commenced crackling at the flaming stakes. Owing to his limitless mercy, he mixes once more with mortals, and in the same form in which he was wont to appear 15 centuries ago. He descends, just at the very moment when before king, courtiers, knights, cardinals, and the fairest dames of court, before the whole population of Seville, upwards of 100 wicked heretics are being roasted in a magnificent auto-da-fe ad majorem Dei gloriam by the order of the powerful Cardinal Grand Inquisitor. He comes silently and unannounced, yet all, how strange, yea, all recognize him at once. The population rushes towards him as if propelled by some irresistible force. It surrounds, throngs, and presses around. It follows him. Silently, and with a smile of boundless compassion upon his lips, he crosses the dense crowd and moves softly on. The sun of love burns in his heart, and warm rays of light, wisdom, and power beam forth from his eyes, and pour down their waves upon the swarming multitudes of the rabble assembled around, making their hearts vibrate with returning love. He extends his hands over their heads, blesses them, and from mere contact with him, aye, even with his garments, a healing power goes forth. An old man, blind from his birth, cries, Lord, heal me that I may see thee. And the scales falling off the closed eyes, the blind man beholds him. The crowd weeps for joy and kisses the ground upon which he treads. Children strew flowers along his path and sing to him, Hosanna. It is he, it is himself, they say to each other. It must be he. It can be none other but he. He pauses at the portal of the old cathedral, just as a wee white coffin is carried in, with tears and great lamentations. The lid is off, and in the coffin lies the body of a fair child, 7 years old, the only child of an eminent citizen of the city. The little corpse lies buried in flowers. "He will raise the child to life!" confidently shouts the crowd to the weeping mother. The officiating priest who had come to meet the funeral procession looks perplexed and frowns. A loud cry is suddenly heard, and the bereaved mother prostrates herself at his feet. "If it be thou, then bring back my child to life," she cries beseechingly. The procession halts, and the little coffin is gently lowered at his feet. Divine compassion beams forth from his eyes, and as he looks at the child, his lips are heard to whisper once more, Talitha cumi, and straightway the damsel arose. The child rises in her coffin. Her little hands still hold the nosegay of white roses, which after death was placed in them, and looking round with large, astonished eyes, she smiles sweetly. The crowd is violently excited. A terrible commotion rages among them. The populace shouts and loudly weeps, when suddenly, before the cathedral door, appears the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor himself. He is tall, gaunt-looking old man of nearly 80 and 10, with a stern, withered face and deeply sunken eyes, from the cavity of which glitter 2 fiery sparks. He has laid aside his gorgeous cardinal's robes, in which he had appeared before the people at the auto-da-fe of the enemies of the Romish Church, and is now clad in his old, rough, monkish cassock. His sullen assistants and slaves of the Holy Guard are following at a distance. He pauses before the crowd and observes. He has seen all. He has witnessed the placing of the little coffin at his feet, the calling back to life. And now his dark, grim face has grown still darker. His bushy grey eyebrows nearly meet, and his sunken eye flashes with sinister light. Slowly raising his finger, he commands his minions to arrest him. Such is his power over the well-disciplined, submissive, and now trembling people that the thick crowds immediately give way, and scattering before the guard, amid dead silence and without one breath of protest, allow them to lay their sacrilegious hands upon the stranger and lead him away. That same populace, like one man, now bows its head to the ground before the old Inquisitor, who blesses it and slowly moves onward. The guards conduct their prisoner to the ancient building of the Holy Tribunal. Pushing him into a narrow, gloomy, vaulted prison cell, they lock him in and retire. The day wanes, and night, a dark, hot, breathless Spanish night, creeps on and settles upon the city of Seville. The air smells of laurels and orange blossoms. In the Cimmerian darkness of the old tribunal hall, the iron door of the cell is suddenly thrown open, and the Grand Inquisitor, holding a dark lantern, slowly stalks into the dungeon. He is alone, and as the heavy door closes behind him, he pauses at the threshold, and for a minute or two silently and gloomily scrutinizes the face before him. At last, approaching with measured steps, he sets his lantern down upon the table and addresses him in these words, "It is thou! Thou!" Receiving no reply, he rapidly continues, "Nay, answer not. Be silent. And what couldst thou say? I know but too well thy answer. Besides, thou hast no right to add one syllable to that which was already uttered by thee before. Why shouldst thou now return, to impede us in our work? For thou hast come but for that only, and thou knowest it well. But art thou as well aware of what awaits thee in the morning? I do not know, nor do I care to know who thou mayest be it thou or only thine image, Tomorrow I will condemn and burn thee on the stake as the most wicked of all the heretics. And that same people who today were kissing thy feet, tomorrow at one bend of my finger will rush to add fuel to thy funeral pile. Wert thou aware of this, he adds, speaking as if in solemn thought, and never for one instant taking his piercing glance off the meek face before him. I can hardly realize the situation described. What is all this, Ivan? Suddenly interrupted Alyosha, who had remained silently listening to his brother. Is this an extravagant fancy, or some mistake of the old man, an impossible quid pro quo? Let it be the latter, if you like, laughed Ivan, since modern realism has so perverted your taste that you feel unable to realize anything from the world of fancy. Let it be a quid pro quo if you so choose it. Again, the Inquisitor is 90 years old, and he might have easily gone mad with his one-idea fix of power, or it might have as well been a delirious vision, called forth by dying fancy, overheated by the auto-da-fe of the 100 heretics in that forenoon. But what matters for the poem whether it was a quid pro quo or an uncontrollable fancy? The question is that the old man has to open his heart, that he must give out his thought at last, and that the hour has come when he does speak it out, and says loudly that which for 90 years he has kept secret within his own breast. And his prisoner, does he never reply? Does he keep silent, looking at him without saying a word? Of course, and it could not well be otherwise, again retorted Ivan. The Grand Inquisitor begins from his very first words by telling him that he has no right to add one syllable to that which he had said before. To make the situation clear at once, the above preliminary monologue is intended to convey to the reader the very fundamental idea which underlies Roman Catholicism. As well as I can convey it, his words mean, in short, everything was given over by thee to the Pope, and everything now rests with him alone. Thou hast no business to return, and thus hinder us in our work. In this sense, the Jesuits not only talk, but write likewise. Hast thou the right to divulge to us a single one of the mysteries of that world whence thou comest? Inquires of him my old Inquisitor, and forthwith answers for him. Nay, thou hast no such right, for that would be adding to that which was already said by thee before, hence depriving people of that freedom for which thou hast so stoutly stood up while yet on earth. Anything new that thou would now proclaim would have to be regarded as an attempt to interfere with that freedom of choice, as it would come as a new and a miraculous revelation, superseding the old revelation of 1500 years ago, when thou didst so repeatedly tell the people, "The truth shall make you free." Behold, then, thy free people now, adds the old man with sombre irony. Yea, it has cost us dearly, he continues, sternly looking at his victim. But we have at last accomplished our task, and in thy name. For 15 long centuries we had to toil and suffer, owing to that freedom. But now we have prevailed, and our work is done, and well and strongly it is done. Believest not thou it is so very strong? And why should thou look at me so meekly, as if I were not worthy even of thy indignation? Know then that now, and only now, thy people feel fully sure and satisfied of their freedom, and that only since they have themselves, and of their own free will, delivered that freedom unto our hands by placing it submissively at our feet. But then, that is what we have done. Is it that which thou hast striven for? Is this the kind of freedom thou hast promised them? Now again, I do not understand, interrupted Alyosha. Does the old man mock and laugh? Not in the least. He seriously regards it as a great service done by himself, his brother monks and Jesuits, to humanity, to have conquered and subjected unto their authority that freedom, and boasts that it was done but for the good of the world. For only now, he says, speaking of the Inquisition, has it become possible to us for the first time to give a serious thought to human happiness. Man is born a rebel, and can rebels be ever happy? Thou hast been fairly warned of it, but evidently to no use, since thou hast rejected the only means which could make mankind happy. Fortunately, at thy departure, thou hast delivered the task to us. Thou hast promised, ratifying the pledge by thy own words, in words giving us the right to bind and unbind. And surely thou couldst not think of depriving us of it now. But what can he mean by the words, "Thou hast been fairly warned"? Asked Alexis. These words give the key to what the old man has to say for his justification. But listen, the terrible and wise spirit, the spirit of self-annihilation and non-being, goes on the Inquisitor. The great spirit of negation conversed with thee in the wilderness, and we are told that he tempted thee. Was it so? And if it were so, then it is impossible to utter anything more truthful than what is contained in his three offers, which thou didst reject, and which are usually called temptations. Yea, if ever there was on earth a genuine striking wonder produced, it was on that day of thy three temptations, and it is precisely in these three short sentences that the marvelous miracle is contained. If it were possible that they should vanish and disappear forever without leaving any trace from the record and from the memory of man, and that it should become necessary again to devise, invent, and make them reappear in thy history once more, thinkest thou that all the world's sages, all the legislators, initiates, philosophers, and thinkers, if called upon to frame three questions which should, like these, besides answering the magnitude of the event, express in three short sentences the whole future history of this our world and of mankind? Dost thou believe, I ask thee, that all their combined efforts could ever create anything equal in power and depth of thought to the three propositions offered thee by the powerful and all-wise Spirit in the wilderness? Judging of them by their marvelous aptness alone, one can at once perceive that they emanated not from a finite, terrestrial intellect, but indeed from the eternal and the absolute. In these three offers we find, blended into one and foretold to us, the complete subsequent history of man. We are shown three images, so to say, uniting in them all the future axiomatic, insoluble problems and contradictions of human nature, the world over. In those days, the wondrous wisdom contained in them was not made so apparent as it is now, for futurity remained still veiled. But now, when 15 centuries have elapsed, we see that everything in these three questions is so marvelously foreseen and foretold that to add to, or to take away from, the prophecy one jot would be absolutely impossible. Decide then thyself, sternly proceeded the Inquisitor, which of ye twain was right, thou who didst reject, or he who offered? Remember the subtle meaning of question the first, which runs thus: wouldst thou go into the world empty-handed? Would thou venture thither with thy vague and undefined promise of freedom, which men, dull and unruly as they are by nature, are unable so much as to understand, which they avoid and fear? For never was there anything more unbearable to the human race than personal freedom. Dost thou see these stones in the desolate and glaring wilderness? Command that these stones be made bread, and mankind will run after thee, obedient and grateful like a herd of cattle. But even then it will be ever diffident and trembling, lest thou should take away thy hand, and they lose thereby their bread. Thou didst refuse to accept the offer for fear of depriving men of their free choice. For where is their freedom of choice, where men are bribed with bread? Man shall not live by bread alone, was thine answer. Thou knewest not, it seems, that it was precisely in the name of that earthly bread that the terrestrial spirit would one day rise against, struggle with, and finally conquer thee, followed by the hungry multitudes shouting, "Who is like unto that beast, who maketh fire come down from heaven upon the earth?" Knowest thou not that, but a few centuries hence, and the whole of mankind will have proclaimed in its wisdom, and through its mouthpiece, science, that there is no more crime, hence no more sin on earth, but only hungry people? Feed us first, and then command us to be virtuous, will be the words written upon the banner lifted against thee. a banner which shall destroy thy church to its very foundations, and in the place of thy temple shall raise once more the terrible Tower of Babel. And though its building be left unfinished, as was that of the first one, yet the fact will remain recorded that thou couldst, but wouldst not, prevent the attempt to build that new tower by accepting the offer, and thus saving mankind a millennium of useless suffering on earth. And it is to us that the people will return again. They will search for us catacombs, as we shall once more be persecuted and martyred, and they will begin crying unto us, Feed us, for they who promised us the fire from heaven have deceived us. It is then that we will finish building their tower for them, for they alone who feed them shall finish it, and we shall feed them in thy name, and lying to them that it is in that name. Oh, never, never will they learn to feed themselves without our help. No science will ever give them bread so long as they remain free, so long as they refuse to lay that freedom at our feet and say, Enslave, but feed us. That day must come when men will understand that freedom and daily bread enough to satisfy all are unthinkable and can never be had together, as men will never be able to fairly divide the two among themselves. And they will also learn that they can never be free, for they are weak, vicious, miserable non-entities born wicked and rebellious. Thou hast promised to them the bread of life, the bread of heaven. But I ask thee again, can that bread ever equal in the sight of the weak and the vicious, the ever ungrateful human race, their daily bread on earth? And even supposing that thousands and tens of thousands follow thee in the name of, and for the sake of, thy heavenly bread, what will become of the millions and hundreds of millions of human beings too weak to scorn the earthly for the sake of thy heavenly bread? Or is it but those tens of thousands chosen among the great and the mighty that are so dear to thee, while the remaining millions, innumerable as the grains of sand in the seas, the weak and the loving, have to be used as material for the former? No, no. In our sight, and for our purpose, the weak and the lowly are the more dear to us. True, they are vicious and rebellious, but we will force them into obedience, and it is they who will admire us the most. They will regard us as gods and feel grateful to those who have consented to lead the masses and bear their burden of freedom by ruling over them. So terrible will that freedom at last appear to men. Then we will tell them that it is in obedience to thy will and in thy name that we rule over them. We will deceive them once more and lie to them once again, for never, never more will we allow thee to come among us. In this deception we will find our suffering, for we must needs lie eternally and never cease to lie. Such is the secret meaning of temptation the first, and that is what thou didst reject in the wilderness for the sake of that freedom which thou didst prize above all. Meanwhile, thy tempter's offer contained another great world mystery. By accepting the bread, thou wouldst have satisfied and answered a universal craving, a ceaseless longing alive in the heart of every individual human being, lurking in the breast of collective mankind, that most perplexing problem, whom or what shall we worship? There exists no greater or more painful anxiety for a man who has freed himself from all religious bias than how he shall soonest find a new object or idea to worship. But man seeks to bow before that only which is recognized by the greater majority, if not by all his fellow men, as having a right to be worshipped, whose rights are so unquestionable that men agree unanimously to bow down to it. For the chief concern of these miserable creatures is not to find and worship the idol of their own choice, but to discover that which all others will believe in and consent to bow down to in a mass. It is that instinctive need of having a worship in common that is the chief suffering of every man, the chief concern of mankind from the beginning of times. It is for that universality of religious worship that people destroyed each other by sword. Creating gods unto themselves, they forthwith began appealing to each other. Abandon your deities, come and bow down to ours, or death to ye and your idols. And so will they do till the end of this world. They will do so even then, when all the gods themselves have disappeared, for then men will prostrate themselves before and worship some idea. Thou didst know, thou couldst not be ignorant of, that mysterious fundamental principle in human nature, and still thou hast rejected the only absolute banner offered thee, to which all the nations would remain true, and before which all would have bowed, the banner of earthly bread, rejected in the name of freedom, and of bread in the kingdom of God. Behold, then, what thou hast done furthermore for that freedom's sake. I repeat to thee, man has no greater anxiety in life than to find someone to whom he can make over that gift of freedom with which the unfortunate creature is born. But he alone will prove capable of silencing and quieting their consciences that shall succeed in possessing himself of the freedom of men. With daily bread, an irresistible power was offered thee. Show a man bread, and he will follow thee. For what can he resist less than the attraction of bread? But if, at the same time, another succeed in possessing himself of his conscience, oh, then even thy bread will be forgotten, and man will follow him who seduced his conscience. So far thou wert right. For the mystery of human being does not solely rest in the desire to live, but in the problem. For what should one live at all? Without a clear perception of his reasons for living, man will never consent to live, and will rather destroy himself than tarry on earth, though he be surrounded with bread. This is the truth. But what has happened? Instead of getting hold of man's freedom, thou hast enlarged it still more. Hast thou again forgotten that to man rest and even death are preferable to a free choice between the knowledge of good and evil? Nothing seems more seductive in his eyes than freedom of conscience, and nothing proves more painful. And behold, instead of laying a firm foundation whereon to rest once for all man's conscience, thou hast chosen to stir up in him all that is abnormal, mysterious, and indefinite, all that is beyond human strength, and has acted as if thou never hadst any love for him, and yet thou wert he who came to lay down his life for his friends. Thou hast burdened man's soul with anxieties hitherto unknown to him, thirsting for human love freely given, seeking to enable man, seduced and charmed by thee, to follow thy path of his own free will, instead of the old and wise law which held him in subjection. Thou hast given him the right henceforth to choose, and freely decide what is good and bad for him, guided but by thine image in his heart. But hast thou never dreamt of the probability, nay, of the certainty, of that same man one day rejected finally, and controverting even thine image and thy truth, once he would find himself laden with such a terrible burden as freedom of choice? That a time would surely come when men would exclaim that truth and light cannot be in thee, for no one could have left them in a greater perplexity and mental suffering than thou hast done, lading them with so many cares and insoluble problems. Thus, it is thyself who hast laid the foundation for the destruction of thine own kingdom, and no one but thou is to be blamed for it. Meantime, every chance of success was offered thee. There are three powers, three unique forces upon earth, capable of conquering forever by charming the conscience of these weak rebels, men for their own good. And these forces are miracle, mystery, and authority. Thou hast rejected all the three, and thus wert the first to set them an example. When the terrible and all-wise Spirit placed thee on a pinnacle of the temple, and said unto thee, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. For thus thy faith in thy Father should have been made evident. Thou didst refuse to accept his suggestion, and didst not follow it. Oh, undoubtedly, thou didst act in this with all the magnificent pride of a god, but then men, that weak and rebel race, are they also gods, to understand thy refusal? Of course, thou didst well know that by taking one single step forward, by making the slightest motion to throw thyself down, thou wouldst have tempted the Lord thy God, lost suddenly all faith in him, and dashed thyself to atoms against that same earth which thou camest to save, and thus wouldst have allowed the wise spirit which tempted thee to triumph and rejoice. But then, how many such as thee are to be found on this globe? I ask thee. Couldst thou ever for a moment imagine that men would have the same strength to resist such a temptation? Is human nature calculated to reject miracle and trust during the most terrible moments in life, when the most momentous, painful, and perplexing problems struggle within man's soul to the free decisions of his heart for the true solution? Oh, thou knewest well that that action of thine would remain recorded in books for ages to come, reaching to the confines of the globe, and thy hope was that, following thy example, man would remain true to his God, without needing any miracle to keep his faith alive. But thou knewest not, it seems, that no sooner would man reject miracle than he would reject God likewise, for he seeketh less God than a sign from him. And thus, as it is beyond the power of man to remain without miracles, so rather than live without, he will create for himself new wonders of his own making, and he will bow to and worship the soothsayer's miracles, the old witch's sorcery, were he a rebel, a heretic, and an atheist 100 times over. Thy refusal to come down from the cross when people, mocking and wagging their heads, were saying to thee, "Save thyself, if thou be the Son of God, and we will believe in thee," was due to the same determination, not to enslave man through miracle, but to obtain faith in thee freely and apart from any miraculous influence. Thou thirstest for free and uninfluenced love, and refuses the passionate adoration of the slave before a potency which would have subjected his will once forever. Thou judgest of men too highly here again, for though rebels they be, they are born slaves, and nothing more. Behold, and judge of them once more, now that 15 centuries have elapsed since that moment. Look at them, whom thou didst try to elevate unto thee. I swear man is weaker and lower than thou hast ever imagined him to be. Can he ever do that which thou art said to have accomplished? By valuing him so highly, thou hast acted as if there were no love for him in thine heart, for thou hast demanded of him more than he could ever give, thou who lovest him more than thyself. Hadst thou esteemed him less, less wouldst thou have demanded of him, and that would have been more like love, for his burden would have been made thereby lighter. Man is weak and cowardly. What matters it, if he now riots and rebels throughout the world against our will and power, and prides himself upon that rebellion? It is but the petty pride and vanity of a schoolboy. It is the rioting of little children, getting up a mutiny in the classroom and driving their schoolmaster out of it. But it will not last long, and when the day of their triumph is over, they will have to pay dearly for it. They will destroy the temples and raze them to the ground, flooding the earth with blood. But the foolish children will have to learn some day that, rebels though they be and riotous from nature, they are too weak to maintain the spirit of mutiny for any length of time. Suffused with idiotic tears, they will confess that he who created them rebellious undoubtedly did so, but to mock them. They will pronounce these words in despair, and such blasphemous utterances will but add to their misery, for human nature cannot endure blasphemy, and takes her own revenge in the end. And thus, after all thou hast suffered for mankind and its freedom, the present fate of men may be summed up in 3 words: unrest, confusion, misery. Thy great prophet John records in his vision that he saw, during the first resurrection of the chosen servants of God, the number of them which were sealed in their foreheads, 12,000 of every tribe. But were they indeed as many? Then they must have been gods, not men. They had shared thy cross for long years, suffered scores of years' hunger and thirst in dreary wildernesses and deserts, feeding upon locusts and roots, and of these children of free love for thee and self-sacrifice in thy name thou mayest well feel proud. But remember that these are but a few thousands, of gods, not men, and how about all others? And why should the weakest be held guilty for not being able to endure what the strongest have endured? Why should a soul incapable of containing such terrible gifts be punished for its weakness? Didst thou really come to and for the elect alone? If so, then the mystery will remain forever mysterious to our finite minds. And if a mystery, then were we right to proclaim it as one and preach it, teaching them that neither their freely given love to thee nor freedom of conscience were essential, but only that incomprehensible mystery which they must blindly obey even against the dictates of their conscience. Thus did we. We corrected and improved thy teaching and based it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. And men rejoiced at finding themselves led once more like a herd of cattle, and at finding their hearts at last delivered of the terrible burden laid upon them by thee, which caused them so much suffering. Tell me, were we right in doing as we did? Did not we show our great love for humanity by realizing in such a humble spirit its helplessness, by so mercifully lightening its great burden, and by permitting and remitting for its weak nature every sin, provided it be committed with our authorization? For what, then, hast thou come again to trouble us in our work? And why lookest thou at me so penetratingly with thy meek eyes, and in such a silence? Rather shouldst thou feel wrath, for I need not thy love. I reject it, and love thee not myself. Why should I conceal the truth from thee? I know but too well with whom I am now talking. What I had to say was known to thee before. I read it in thine eye. How should I conceal from thee our secret? If perchance thou wouldst hear it from my own lips, then listen. We are not with thee, but with him, and that is our secret. For centuries have we abandoned thee to follow him. Yes, 8 centuries. 800 years now since we accepted from him the gift rejected by thee with indignation. That last gift which he offered thee from the high mountain, when, showing all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, he saith unto thee, all these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. We took Rome from him, and the glaive of Caesar, and declared ourselves alone the kings of this earth, its sole kings, though our work is not yet fully accomplished. But who is to blame for it? Our work is but in its incipient stage, but it is nevertheless started. We may have long to wait until its culmination, and mankind have to suffer much, but we shall reach the goal some day, and become sole Caesars, and then will be the time to think of universal happiness for men. Thou couldst accept the glaive of Caesar thyself. Why didst thou reject the offer? By accepting from the powerful spirit his third offer, thou would have realized every aspiration man seeketh for himself on earth. Man would have found a constant object for worship, one to deliver his conscience up to, and one that should unite all together into one common and harmonious ant-hill. For an innate necessity for universal union constitutes the third and final affliction of mankind. Humanity as a whole has ever aspired to unite itself universally. Many were the great nations with great histories, but the greater they were, the more unhappy they felt, as they felt the stronger necessity of a universal union among men. Great conquerors like Timur and Chenghis Khan passed like a cyclone upon the face of the earth in their efforts to conquer the universe, but even they, albeit unconsciously, expressed the same aspiration towards universal and common union. In accepting the kingdom of the world and Caesar's purple, one would found a universal kingdom and secure to mankind eternal peace. And who can rule mankind better than those who have possessed themselves of man's conscience and hold in their hand man's daily bread? Having accepted Caesar's glaive and purple, we had, of course, but to deny thee, to henceforth follow him alone. Oh, centuries of intellectual riot and rebellious free thought are yet before us, and their science will end by anthropophagy, for having begun to build their Babylonian tower without our help, they will have to end by anthropophagy. But it is precisely at that time that the beast will crawl up to us in full submission and lick the soles of our feet and sprinkle them with tears of blood. And we shall sit upon the scarlet-colored beast, and lifting up high the golden cup, full of abomination and filthiness, shall show written upon it the word mystery. But it is only then that men will see the beginning of a kingdom of peace and happiness. Thou art proud of thine own elect, but thou hast none other but these elect, and we will give rest to all. But that is not the end. Many are those among thine elect and the labourers of thy vineyard, who, tired of waiting for thy coming, already have carried and will yet carry the great fervour of their hearts and their spiritual strength into another field, and will end by lifting up against thee thine own banner of freedom. But it is thyself thou hast to thank. Under our rule and sway all will be happy, and will neither rebel nor destroy each other as they did while under thy free banner. Oh, we will take good care to prove to them that they will become absolutely free only when they have abjured their freedom in our favour and submit to us absolutely. Thinkest thou we shall be right or still lying? They will convince themselves of our rightness, for they will see what a depth of degrading slavery and strife that liberty of thine has led them into. Liberty, freedom of thought and conscience and science will lead them into such impassable chasms, place them face to face before such wonders and insoluble mysteries, that some of them, more rebellious and ferocious than the rest, will destroy themselves. Others, rebellious but weak, will destroy each other, while the remainder, weak, helpless, and miserable, will crawl back to our feet and cry, Yes, right were ye, O fathers of Jesus. Ye alone are in possession of his mystery, and we return to you, praying that ye save us from ourselves. Receiving their bread from us, they will clearly see that we take the bread from them, the bread made by their own hands, but to give it back to them in equal shares, and that without any miracle. And having ascertained that, though we have not changed stones into bread, yet bread they have, while every other bread turned verily in their own hands into stones, they will be only too glad to have it so. Until that day, they will never be happy. And who is it that helped the most to blind them? Tell me, who separated the flock and scattered it over ways unknown, if it be not thee? But we will gather the sheep once more and subject them to our will forever. We will prove to them their own weakness and make them humble again, whilst with thee they have learnt but pride, for thou hast made more of them than they ever were worth. We will give them that quiet, humble happiness, which alone benefits such weak, foolish creatures as they are, and having once had proved to them their weakness, they will become timid and obedient, and gather around us as chickens around their hen. They will wonder at and feel a superstitious admiration for us, and feel proud to be led by men so powerful and wise that a handful of them can subject a flock 1,000 million strong. Gradually, men will begin to fear us. They will nervously dread our slightest anger. Their intellects will weaken. Their eyes become as easily accessible to tears as those of children and women. But we will teach them an easy transition from grief and tears to laughter, childish joy and mirthful song. Yes, we will make them work like slaves, but during their recreation hours they shall have an innocent, childlike life, full of play and merry laughter. We will even permit them sin, for weak and helpless, they will feel the more love for us for permitting them to indulge in it. We will tell them that every kind of sin will be remitted to them, so long as it is done with our permission, that we take all these sins upon ourselves, for we so love the world that we are even willing to sacrifice our souls for its satisfaction. And appearing before them in the light of their scapegoats and redeemers, we shall be adored the more for it. They will have no secrets from us. It will rest with us to permit them to live with their wives and concubines, or to forbid them to have children or remain childless, either way depending on the degree of their obedience to us. And they will submit most joyfully to us the most agonizing secrets of their souls. All, all will they lay down at our feet, and we will authorize and remit them all in thy name, and they will believe us and accept our mediation with rapture, as it will deliver them from their greatest anxiety and torture, that of having to decide freely for themselves. And all will be happy, all except the 1 or 200,000 of their rulers. For it is but we the keepers of the great mystery, who will be miserable. There will be thousands of millions of happy infants and 100,000 martyrs who have taken upon themselves the curse of knowledge of good and evil. Peaceable will be their end, and peacefully will they die in thy name, to find behind the portals of the grave but death. But we will keep the secret inviolate, and deceive them for their own good, with the mirage of life eternal in thy kingdom. For, were there really anything like life beyond the grave, surely it would never fall to the lot of such as they. People tell us and prophesy of thy coming and triumphing once more on earth, of thy appearing with the army of thy elect, with thy proud and mighty ones. But we will answer thee that they have saved but themselves, while we have saved all. We are also threatened with the great disgrace which awaits the whore, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, who sits upon the beast, holding in her hands the mystery, the word written upon her forehead. And we are told that the weak ones, the lambs, shall rebel against her, and shall make her desolate and naked. But then will I arise, and point out to thee the thousands of millions of happy infants free from any sin. And we who have taken their sins upon us for their own good shall stand before thee and say, Judge us, if thou canst and darest. Know then that I fear thee not. Know that I too have lived in the dreary wilderness, where I fed upon locusts and roots, that I too have blessed freedom with which thou hast blessed men, and that I too have once prepared to join the ranks of thy elect, the proud and the mighty. But I awoke from my delusion, and refused since then to serve insanity. I returned to join the legion of those who corrected thy mistakes. I left the proud, and returned to the really humble, and for their own happiness. What I now tell thee will come to pass, and our kingdom shall be built. I tell thee not later than tomorrow thou shalt see that obedient flock which at one simple motion of my hand will rush to add burning coals to thy stake, on which I will burn thee for having dared to come and trouble us in our work. For, if there ever was one who deserved more than any of the others our inquisitorial fires, it is thee. Tomorrow I will burn thee. Dixie. Ivan paused. He had entered into the situation and had spoken with great animation, but now he suddenly burst out laughing. "But all that is absurd," suddenly exclaimed Alyosha, who had hitherto listened perplexed and agitated, but in profound silence. "Your poem is a glorification of Christ, not an accusation, as you, perhaps, meant to be. And who will believe you when you speak of freedom? Is it thus that we Christians must understand it? It is Rome, not all Rome, for that would be unjust, but the worst of the Roman Catholics, the Inquisitors and Jesuits, that you have been exposing. Your Inquisitor is an impossible character. What are these sins they are taking upon themselves? Who are those keepers of mystery who took upon themselves a curse for the good of mankind? Who ever met them? We all know the Jesuits, and no one has a good word to say in their favor. But when were they as you depict them? Never, never. The Jesuits are merely a Romish army making ready for their future temporal kingdom with a mitred emperor, a Roman high priest at their head. That is their ideal and object, without any mystery or elevated suffering. The most prosaic thirsting for power for the sake of the mean and earthly pleasures of life, a desire to enslave their fellow men, something like our late system of serfs, with themselves at the head as landed proprietors. That is all that they can be accused of. They may not believe in God, that is also possible, but your suffering Inquisitor is simply a fancy." "Hold, hold," interrupted Ivan, smiling. "Do not be so excited. A fancy, you say? Be it so. Of course, it is a fancy. But stop. Do you really imagine that all this Catholic movement during the last centuries is naught but a desire for power for the mere purpose of mean pleasures? Is this what your father Pacey taught you?" "No, no, quite the reverse. For Father Pacey once told me something very similar to what you yourself say, though, of course, not that. Something quite different," suddenly added Alexis, blushing. A precious piece of information, notwithstanding your not that. I ask you, why should the inquisitors and the Jesuits of your imagination live but for the attainment of mean material pleasures? Why should there not be found among them one single genuine martyr suffering under a great and holy idea and loving humanity with all his heart? Now let us suppose that among all these Jesuits, thirsting and hungering, but after mean material pleasures, there may be one, just one, like my old Inquisitor, who had himself fed upon roots in the wilderness, suffered the tortures of damnation while trying to conquer flesh in order to become free and perfect, but who had never ceased to love humanity, and who one day prophetically beheld the truth, who saw as plain as he could see that the bulk of humanity could never be happy under the old system, that it was not for them that the great idealist had come and died and dreamt of his universal harmony. Having realized that truth, he returned into the world and joined intelligent and practical people. Is this so impossible? Joined whom? What intelligent and practical people? Exclaimed Alyosha, quite excited. Why should they be more intelligent than other men? And what secrets and mysteries can they have? They have neither. Atheism and infidelity is all the secret they have. Your inquisitor does not believe in God, and that is all the mystery there is in it. It may be so. You have guessed rightly there. And it is so, and that is his whole secret. But is this not the acutest sufferings for such a man as he, who killed all his young life in asceticism in the desert, and yet could not cure himself of his love towards his fellowmen? Toward the end of his life, he becomes convinced that it is only by following the advice of the great and terrible spirit that the fate of these millions of weak rebels, these half-finished samples of humanity created in mockery, can be made tolerable. And once convinced of it, he sees as clearly that to achieve that object, one must follow blindly the guidance of the wise spirit, the fearful spirit of death and destruction. Hence, accept a system of lies and deception and lead humanity consciously this time toward death and destruction, and moreover, be deceiving them all the while in order to prevent them from realizing where they are being led, and so force the miserable blind men to feel happy, at least while here on earth. And note this, a wholesale deception in the name of him, in whose ideal the old man had so passionately, so fervently believed during nearly his whole life. Is this no suffering? And was such a solitary exception found amidst, and at the head of, that army that thirsts for power, but for the sake of the mean pleasures of life? Think you one such man would not suffice to bring on a tragedy? Moreover, one single man like my Inquisitor as a principal leader would prove sufficient to discover the real guiding idea of the Romish system with all its armies of Jesuits, the greatest and chiefest conviction that the solitary type described in my poem has at no time ever disappeared from among the chief leaders of that movement. Who knows but that terrible old man, loving humanity so stubbornly and in such an original way, exists even in our days in the shape of a whole host of such solitary exceptions, whose existence is not due to mere chance, but to a well-defined association born of mutual consent, to a secret league, organized several centuries back, in order to guard the mystery from the indiscreet eyes of the miserable and weak people, and only in view of their own happiness. And so it is. It cannot be otherwise. I suspect that even Masons have some such mystery underlying the basis of their organization, and that it is just the reason why the Roman Catholic clergy hate them so, dreading to find in them rivals, competition, the dismemberment of the unity of the idea, for the realization of which one flock and one shepherd are needed. However, in defending my idea, I look like an author whose production is unable to stand criticism. Enough of this. You are, perhaps, a Mason yourself, exclaimed Alyosha. You do not believe in God, he added, with a note of profound sadness in his voice. But suddenly remarking that his brother was looking at him with mockery, how do you mean then to bring your poem to a close? He unexpectedly inquired, casting his eyes downward. Or does it break off here? My intention is to end it with the following scene. Having disburdened his heart, the Inquisitor waits for some time to hear his prisoner speak in his turn. His silence weighs upon him. He has seen that his captive has been attentively listening to him all the time, with his eyes fixed penetratingly and softly on the face of his jailer, and evidently bent upon not replying to him. The old man longs to hear his voice, to hear him reply, better words of bitterness and scorn than his silence. Suddenly he rises. Slowly and silently approaching the Inquisitor, he bends towards him and softly kisses the bloodless 80-and-10-year-old lips. That is all the answer. The Grand Inquisitor shudders. There is a convulsive twitch at the corner of his mouth. He goes to the door, opens it, and addressing him, "Go," he says, "go, and return no more. Do not come again, never, never," and lets him out into the dark night. The prisoner vanishes. And the old man? The kiss burns his heart, but the old man remains firm in his own ideas and unbelief. "And you, together with him? You too," despairingly exclaimed Alyosha, while Ivan burst into a still louder fit of laughter.